The blistering summer sun beat down on Grace Williams as she stood trembling on the wooden auction platform at the Clearwater County Fair of 1875. Her hands, bound loosely with coarse rope, shook not from the heat, but from the terror of what was happening. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been a schoolteacher in Boston with dreams of independence. Now, she was property being sold to cover her late father's debts she hadn't even known existed until the creditors came knocking. Next up, a fine, educated woman from back east, bellowed the auctioneer, a portly man whose sweat-stained shirt clung to his bulging stomach. Reads and writes, can keep your books or teach your young uns. Starting bid is $50. Grace bit her lip hard to keep from crying. At 22, she had imagined a life of purpose and dignity. The frontier town of Aspen, Colorado, had seemed like an adventure when she'd agreed to come west to settle her father's affairs. She never imagined those affairs would include her own sale. A murmur rippled through the crowd of men. Some leered openly at her, while others seemed uncomfortable with the proceedings but unwilling to object. In the back, several wealthy ranchers with clean hats and well-tailored vests began calling out bids. $60, $75, $100 for the schoolmarm. The amounts escalated quickly, and Grace felt bile rising in her throat. Her blue calico dress, once a source of pride, now felt like a costume in some horrible theatrical performance. She scanned the crowd desperately, searching for any face that might show compassion. That's when she saw him. Tall and broad-shouldered, he stood apart from the bidders, arms crossed over his chest. His face, partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, bore an expression of tightly controlled anger. Unlike the others, he wasn't shouting numbers. $200, called a heavy-set man with a cruel smile. She'll make a fine addition to my household. Grace recognized him as Vernon Blackwell, owner of the largest cattle operation in the county and a man known for his harsh treatment of workers. Her heart sank. Going once, the auctioneer called out, his gavel raised. Going twice. The tall stranger suddenly stepped forward, his movement drawing all eyes. With deliberate steps, he approached the auction platform. "I'll win her with my hands, not my coins," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent fairground. The auctioneer blinked in confusion. "That ain't how this works, mister. Today it does." The stranger removed his hat, revealing sun-streaked brown hair and piercing blue eyes. "I'm challenging any man who bids on this woman to face me. You win, you get her fair and square. I win, she walks free. This is preposterous." Blackwell sputtered. The stranger turned to face him. "Is it? Or are you afraid to back your money with your fists, Blackwell?" A ripple of interest passed through the crowd. The auctioneer looked uncertainly toward the sheriff, who had been observing the proceedings with obvious discomfort. "I don't see why not," the sheriff finally said. "Might settle this matter in a way that sits better with the law. I never did cotton to selling women, debt or no debt." "This is an outrage," Blackwell protested. "I bid fair and square." "Then prove you deserve to win," the stranger countered. "Unless your courage doesn't match your wallet." Grace watched the exchange with growing hope. Who was this man? Why would he put himself at risk for a stranger? The crowd began to chant for a fight, the auction forgotten in the excitement of potential entertainment. "Fine," Blackwell growled. "I'll beat you bloody and take what I paid for." The stranger smiled slightly, though no humor reached his eyes. "We'll see." As the crowd formed a makeshift fighting ring, the stranger approached Grace. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, weathered by sun and wind. "Name's Preston Dawson," he said quietly. "Ranch owner out past Cottonwood Creek. I don't aim to own you, miss. No person should own another, but I couldn't stand by and watch this." "Grace Williams," she whispered. Why are you doing this? His eyes held her steadily. Because it's right. And because I've seen what happens to women in Blackwell's care. Before she could respond, he was led away to the center of the ring. The sheriff cut Grace's bonds but kept her at the edge of the crowd under guard. Preston removed his vest and rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing muscular forearms marked with old scars. Blackwell handed his jacket to one of his ranch hands and swaggered into position, confidence evident in every movement of his substantial frame. "Last chance to back down," Blackwell taunted. Preston said nothing, simply raising his fists in a practiced boxer's stance. At the sheriff's signal, Blackwell charged forward with a roar, swinging a meaty fist at Preston's head. The cowboy slipped the punch with surprising agility and countered with 2 quick jabs to Blackwell's ribs. The crowd roared its approval as the men circled each other. Blackwell was stronger and heavier, but Preston moved with the practiced ease of someone who had fought many times before. For several minutes, they exchanged blows. Blackwell landed a heavy hit that sent Preston staggering, and Grace gasped. But Preston recovered quickly, ducking under Blackwell's follow-up swing and delivering a series of punches to the larger man's body. Sweat poured down both men's faces as the fight continued. Blackwell was slowing, his breathing labored. Preston, though bleeding from a cut above his eye, maintained his disciplined stance. When Blackwell lunged forward again, Preston sidestepped and delivered a devastating right cross that connected squarely with the rancher's jaw. Blackwell crashed to the ground like a felled tree. The crowd fell silent, then erupted in cheers. Preston stood over his opponent, chest heaving but expression calm. He reached down and offered Blackwell a hand up, which the defeated man slapped away before staggering to his feet. "This ain't over," Blackwell snarled, spitting blood. "It is for today," Preston replied evenly. The sheriff stepped forward. "The lady's debt is considered settled by combat, as agreed. Miss Williams, you're free to go." Grace could hardly believe what had happened. As the crowd began to disperse, Preston approached her, putting his vest back on despite the bloodstains on his shirt. "You're truly free now," he said. "Though I reckon you might need some help getting on your feet in a new town." "I don't know how to thank you," Grace said, her voice trembling, "but I don't want to be anyone's burden." "No burden," Preston said. "I have a proposition if you're willing to hear it." Grace hesitated, wary of what this proposition might entail after what she'd just been through. Noticing her hesitation, Preston quickly added, "My ranch needs a teacher for the workers' children. 15 families with no schooling. I'd offer fair wages and a cabin of your own, no strings attached." "Why would you do that for me?" Grace asked. Preston's weathered face softened slightly. "Everyone deserves a chance at a decent life, Miss Williams. I had someone give me mine once, just passing it along." Grace looked around the fairground at the curious faces still watching them, at Blackwell's retreating back as his men helped him to his wagon. She had no money, no connections, and nowhere to go. But this cowboy, this stranger, had fought for her freedom when no one else would. "I accept your offer, Mr. Dawson," she said finally, "at least until I can repay you somehow." Preston shook his head. "No repayment necessary, and it's Preston, please." "Preston," she repeated, testing the name. "Then I'm Grace." For the first time, a genuine smile crossed his face, transforming his stern features. "Well then, Grace, welcome to Colorado, real welcome, not whatever this was." He gestured at the auction platform with disgust. "Let's get you away from here." As they walked away from the county fair, Grace felt something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon: hope. Whatever lay ahead on Preston Dawson's ranch, it had to be better than what she'd just escaped. And perhaps, just perhaps, she'd found not just a savior but a friend in this rugged land. The journey to Preston's ranch was a quiet one. Grace sat beside him on the wagon bench, watching the terrain change from the bustling town of Aspen to the wide open spaces of the Colorado frontier. The majestic Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still snow-capped even in August. "How long have you been in Colorado?" Grace asked, breaking the silence. Preston adjusted the reins slightly before answering. "Going on 8 years now. Came out after the war with not much more than the clothes on my back and a few dollars in my pocket." "The war?" Grace glanced at him with renewed interest. He nodded, his expression growing distant. "Served with the Union. 19th Massachusetts Infantry. Came home to find my family farm sold off for taxes. Decided to head west and start fresh." Grace considered this new information. "And now you have your own ranch." A ghost of a smile appeared on Preston's face. "Didn't happen overnight. Worked as a hand on 3 different spreads. Saved every penny. Found a homestead claim with good water that nobody wanted because the previous owner had been killed by raiders. Fixed it up, bought a few cattle, worked hard. Been building it ever since." "It sounds like you've earned everything you have," Grace observed. Preston glanced at her. "Most folks out here have similar stories. It's not an easy life, but it's a good one." He paused. "What about you?" "How does a Boston schoolteacher end up at a county fair auction?" Grace sighed, looking down at her hands. "My father was a merchant. After my mother died 5 years ago, he started drinking and gambling. I had no idea how bad things had gotten. When he passed away 3 months ago, I received a letter saying I needed to come settle his affairs in Aspen. He'd apparently invested in a mine here." "Let me guess, the mine went bust," Preston said grimly. Grace nodded. "When I arrived, I discovered he had borrowed heavily against my name without my knowledge. The creditors claimed I was legally responsible. When I couldn't pay, they—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Preston's knuckles whitened on the reins. "That's not right. Not legal either, I'd wager." "The local judge seemed to disagree," Grace said bitterly. "He's apparently good friends with several of the creditors." "Judge Harmon," Preston muttered. "Man's been in the pocket of the mining interest for years. Law gets twisted something fierce when there's money involved." They fell silent again as the wagon crested a hill. Below them stretched a verdant valley bisected by a winding creek. Nestled against the foothills was a collection of buildings, a large main house, a bunkhouse, several barns, and scattered smaller cabins. Cattle dotted the pastures and horses grazed in a fenced paddock. "Welcome to Dawson Ranch," Preston said, a note of pride in his voice. Grace took in the scene with wonder. After the chaos and fear of the past weeks, the peaceful vista before her seemed almost unreal. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. As they approached the ranch, Grace noticed several women hanging laundry outside one of the cabins. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Men were working in the corrals and barns, but they paused to wave as the wagon passed. "You have quite a community here," Grace observed. Preston nodded. "Can't run a ranch alone. Most of my hands have families. Good people. They work hard and I try to treat them fair." He guided the horses toward a small cabin set slightly apart from the others near a grove of aspens. "This will be your place. It's not fancy, but it's solid. Used to belong to our last teacher before she married one of my foremen and moved to his cabin." The wagon came to a stop, and Preston jumped down, coming around to offer Grace his hand. She hesitated only briefly before accepting his help, aware of the curious eyes watching from various points around the ranch. The cabin was indeed small, just one room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves. But it was clean, with curtains on the windows and a colorful quilt on the bed. Mrs. Callahan from the main house put things in order when I sent word we'd have a new teacher, Preston explained, looking slightly embarrassed. She's our cook and housekeeper, treats the place like her kingdom. As if summoned by her name, a stout woman with iron-gray hair hurried toward them from the main house. "So this is our new schoolmarm," she called out, her Irish accent thick despite what must have been years in America. "Saints preserve us, child, you look half-starved." "Didn't they feed you in that town?" Before Grace could answer, Mrs. Callahan had taken her arm and was patting her hand. "Don't you worry now. We'll have you right as rain in no time. Dinner's at 6 in the main house. Mr. Dawson, you might want to clean up that face of yours before you come to my table." Preston touched his cheek, seeming to remember for the first time the cuts and bruises from his fight. "Yes, madam." Mrs. Callahan gave a satisfied nod. "I've left some fresh water and soap in the cabin. And there's a trunk of clothes the ladies put together. Might not be fancy Eastern fashions, but they'll do until you get settled." "That's very kind, but I couldn't possibly," Grace began. "Nonsense. We take care of our own here," Mrs. Callahan declared firmly. "Now, I must get back to my kitchen before those ranch hands steal all my biscuits." With that, she bustled off, leaving Grace speechless. Preston chuckled. "Mrs. Callahan has been with me since the beginning. She and her husband were the first to join me here. He passed 2 winters ago, but she stayed on. Says we'd all starve without her, and she's probably right." Grace felt overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. "Everyone seems so willing to help. You don't even know me." "That's how it works out here," Preston said simply. "Nobody survives alone. I'll let you get settled. School building is that larger cabin by the creek. Has a bell and everything. 27 children aged 5 to 15 if my count is right. They're good kids, just haven't had proper schooling in about 8 months. 27. Grace blinked in surprise. "Too many." Preston looked concerned. "No, not at all," Grace assured him quickly. "I taught 45 in Boston. I'm just surprised there are so many families here." Preston's expression softened with pride. "Like I said, it's a community. We'll introduce you proper at dinner." He hesitated, then added, "If you need anything before then, the main house is always open." After he left, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, taking in her new surroundings. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. The walls around her weren't a prison but a sanctuary. Outside the window, children's laughter mingled with the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of aspen leaves. She opened the trunk Mrs. Callahan had mentioned and found dresses, undergarments, a warm shawl, and even a pair of sturdy boots that looked close to her size. A note on top read simply, "Welcome, teacher." Grace ran her fingers over the simple garments, touched by the generosity. These people didn't know her, yet they had prepared for her arrival with such thoughtfulness. In Boston, she had known her neighbors for years without ever experiencing such warmth. Using the water and soap provided, she washed away the grime of the auction and the journey. She changed into one of the dresses, a practical blue cotton that was a bit loose but clean and whole. As she braided her long brown hair, she caught sight of her reflection in a small mirror hanging by the door. The face that looked back at her seemed different somehow. Still her own features, the straight nose, the determined chin, the wide brown eyes, but something had changed. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that she had survived. Or perhaps it was the first stirring of something she hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. At precisely 6 o'clock, Grace made her way to the main house. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard, and lamps were being lit in windows. The sounds of conversation and laughter spilled from the open door of the large 2-story home. Taking a deep breath, Grace stepped inside. The main room was filled with people, men, women, and children of various ages. A long table stretched down the center, already laden with platters of food. At the head stood Preston, freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt, though bruises still marked his face. The room fell silent as Grace entered, all eyes turning toward her. She fought the urge to retreat. "Everyone," Preston said, his deep voice filling the room, "this is Miss Grace Williams, our new teacher. She's come a long way to be here, and I expect you all to make her welcome." To Grace's surprise, the room erupted in applause. Children stared at her with open curiosity while their parents smiled warmly. Mrs. Callahan appeared at her side, guiding her to a seat near Preston at the head of the table. "Don't mind them," the older woman whispered. "We've been desperate for a proper teacher. These youngsters are wild as jackrabbits without schooling." Throughout dinner, Grace was introduced to so many people she knew she would never remember all their names. The Miller family with 5 children, the Johnsons with their twins, the Garcias who had come north from New Mexico, the Freemans, a black family who had homesteaded nearby but worked at the ranch. Each had a story, each greeted her with genuine welcome. Preston spoke little during the meal, but Grace often felt his eyes on her. When she glanced his way, he would quickly turn his attention elsewhere, but there was something in his gaze that made her cheeks warm. After dinner, several of the mothers approached to discuss the school. They were eager to show her the schoolhouse the next day and introduce their children properly. The men respectfully tipped their hats when introduced, though a few of the younger, unmarried ranch hands seemed particularly eager to make her acquaintance. As the evening wound down and families began returning to their cabins, Preston approached Grace. "Too overwhelming?" he asked quietly. "A bit," she admitted, "but in a good way. They seem like wonderful people." "They are," Preston agreed, "and they're excited to have a teacher again. The children especially." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the last families depart, calling good nights across the yard. "Thank you," Grace said suddenly. "Not just for today at the auction, but for bringing me here, for giving me a chance to start over." Preston studied her face in the lamplight. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Grace. I got mine when I came west. Maybe this is yours." Something in his voice made her heart beat faster. This man who had risked himself for a stranger, who had built this thriving community from nothing, who looked at her now with such quiet intensity he was unlike anyone she had ever known. "Good night, Preston," she said softly. He smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Good night, Grace. Sleep well." As she walked back to her cabin under a sky brilliant with stars, Grace felt a curious lightness in her spirit. Just hours ago, she had stood on an auction block, her future bleak and terrifying. Now she had a home, a purpose, and perhaps even friends. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same courage that had brought her west in the first place. And perhaps, she thought as she glanced back to see Preston still watching from the porch of the main house, she wasn't as alone as she had believed. Dawn broke over Dawson Ranch in a spectacular display of pinks and golds that painted the mountains in ethereal light. Grace awoke to the unfamiliar sounds of a working ranch rooster's crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, the metallic clang of tools from the blacksmith's forge. For a moment, she was disoriented, the events of the previous day rushing back in a flood of memory. She dressed quickly in one of the donated dresses, grateful for its practicality. Boston fashions with their tight corsets and multiple petticoats would have been impractical here. She braided her hair simply and splashed water on her face from the basin. Outside, the ranch was already bustling with activity. Cowboys rode out toward the pastures, women carried baskets of laundry to the washing area by the creek, and children darted between buildings on morning errands. Several people called greetings as Grace made her way toward the main house, where Mrs. Callahan had instructed her to come for breakfast. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of coffee, bacon, and fresh bread. Several ranch hands sat at a long table, eating heartily while Mrs. Callahan presided over a massive cast iron stove. "There you are, Miss Williams," the older woman called cheerfully. "Come, sit. You need a proper meal to start your day." Grace accepted a plate heaped with more food than she usually ate in an entire day. "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan, but I couldn't possibly." "Nonsense. Out here, we work hard and eat accordingly. You'll get used to it." The housekeeper poured her a cup of strong coffee. "Mr. Dawson's been up since before dawn, checking the north pasture. Some trouble with wolves last night, but nothing serious." One of the ranch hands, a young man with a shock of red hair, leaned across the table. "I'm Tobias, miss. We didn't get properly introduced last night. I help with the horses mostly." "It's nice to meet you, Tobias," Grace replied politely, noting the interest in his eyes that went beyond simple welcome. Before the conversation could continue, the kitchen door swung open and Preston entered, bringing with him the scent of horses and fresh air. His presence immediately commanded the room, the ranch hands straightening slightly in their seats. "Morning," he said, nodding to everyone before his eyes settled on Grace. "Sleep well." "Very well, thank you," she answered, suddenly conscious of her simple appearance. If Preston noticed her self-consciousness, he gave no sign. He accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Callahan and leaned against the counter rather than sitting. "Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Freeman will show you the schoolhouse after breakfast," he told Grace. "They've been keeping things in order, but I imagine you'll want to arrange it to your liking before classes start." "When do you expect me to begin teaching?" Grace asked. "Monday would be good if you're ready. Gives you 3 days to prepare." Preston sipped his coffee. "We've got books, not many, but enough to start. Supply wagon comes through once a month, and I've put in an order for whatever else you might need." Grace was touched by his thoughtfulness. "That's very generous." "Education's important," Preston said simply. "My father believed that. Only had schooling through 8th grade himself, but made sure I finished properly." This glimpse into his past intrigued Grace. Despite his rough exterior and frontier life, Preston Dawson was clearly a man who valued learning. It added another dimension to the already complex picture she was forming of him. After breakfast, as promised, 2 of the ranch wives escorted Grace to the schoolhouse. It was a single-room building larger than her cabin, with rows of rough-hewn benches and desks facing a teacher's desk on a small raised platform. Tall windows let in ample light, and a pot-bellied stove stood in one corner for winter heating. "It ain't fancy, Mrs. Freeman said apologetically, but it's sturdy. My husband helped build it 2 years back." "It's perfect," Grace assured her, already envisioning how she would arrange things. "Are those the books Mr. Dawson mentioned?" Mrs. Miller opened a large trunk by the teacher's desk. "We've got McGuffey readers for the different levels, some arithmetic books, a few history texts. Bible, of course. Mr. Dawson's added to the collection whenever he can." Grace knelt beside the trunk, examining the books with growing excitement. "These are wonderful resources. In my school in Boston, we had to share fewer books among more students." The women exchanged pleased glances. "Mr. Dawson said you was a real teacher," Mrs. Freeman said with satisfaction. "My Robert and Josephine need proper learning. They're smart children, just need guidance." "All the children will get my best effort," Grace promised. They spent the morning cleaning the schoolhouse and discussing the students' various levels and needs. Grace learned that the children ranged from complete beginners to some who had several years of education before coming west. A few spoke Spanish or German as their first language, adding another challenge to her teaching plan. By noon, Grace had a list of supplies she needed and a preliminary plan for organizing classes. The women invited her to join them for the midday meal at the creek, where many of the ranch families gathered during the warm months. The scene by the creek was lively and communal. Women spread blankets in the shade of cottonwood trees while children splashed in the shallow water. Men on their break from ranch work lounged nearby, some napping, others playing cards or checkers. As Grace sat with Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Freeman, several children approached cautiously to meet their new teacher. They were a diverse group, some fair-haired and freckled, others with dark complexions and eyes that spoke of Mexican or native heritage, all sun-browned from outdoor life. "Are you really from Boston?" asked a bold girl of about 10. "I am," Grace confirmed. "Have you heard of Boston?" The child nodded vigorously. "Pa says that's where they threw all the tea in the harbor to spite the king," Grace laughed. "That's right, though it happened quite a long time ago." More children gathered as Grace answered their questions about the East and what they would learn in school. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and she found herself genuinely looking forward to teaching again. From across the creek, Grace noticed Preston watching the scene. He stood apart, as seemed to be his habit, observing rather than participating. When their eyes met, he nodded slightly but didn't approach. Mrs. Miller followed Grace's gaze. "Mr. Dawson keeps to himself mostly," she said quietly. "Been that way as long as I've known him. Good man, fair employer, generous when folks need help but doesn't mix much. Has he never married?" Grace asked, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. Mrs. Freeman exchanged a look with Mrs. Miller. "There was someone, years back," she said carefully. "Before my time, but folk talk. A widow who came to cook for the ranch when it was just starting. They were sweet on each other, planning to marry." "What happened?" Grace couldn't help asking. "Influenza swept through one winter," Mrs. Miller continued. "Took her and her young son both. They say Mr. Dawson changed after that. Threw himself into building the ranch, stopped attending socials in town. Some of the local girls have tried to catch his eye, but he's never shown interest." Grace watched as Preston turned away to speak with one of his foremen. The story explained something about the sadness she occasionally glimpsed behind his controlled exterior. The afternoon passed pleasantly, as Grace continued to meet ranch residents and learn more about her new home. Several mothers offered additional resources for the school: homemade slates, extra paper, even a set of maps that one family had brought from St. Louis. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Grace headed back to her cabin to organize her notes and plans for the school. The path took her past the corral where several men were working with horses. Preston stood in the center, his shirt sleeves rolled up, handling a spirited young bay with calm expertise. Grace paused to watch, impressed by the communication between man and horse. Preston moved with confidence, his gestures firm but never harsh. The horse, initially skittish, gradually relaxed under his touch. "He has a way with them," said a voice beside her. Grace turned to find Tobias, the young ranch hand from breakfast, leaning against the fence rail. "He certainly does," she agreed. "Mr. Dawson says horses are like people, they respond better to patience than force." Tobias glanced at her with undisguised admiration. "We're all mighty pleased to have a teacher here again, Miss Williams, especially one as pretty as you." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you, Tobias, but I hope my teaching abilities will be more relevant than my appearance." "Oh, I didn't mean," the young man stammered, face reddening. "It's quite all right," Grace assured him, not wanting to embarrass him further. "I should continue to my cabin. I have preparations to make for Monday." As she turned to leave, she noticed Preston had stopped his work with the horse and was watching them, his expression unreadable. He nodded briefly when she caught his eye, then returned his attention to the bay. Back in her cabin, Grace spent the evening planning lessons and organizing student groups based on the information she'd gathered. The work was familiar and comforting, reminding her of happier days in Boston before her father's death. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Preston standing there, hat in hand. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "Not at all," Grace replied, suddenly conscious of the simple cabin and her informal appearance. "Would you like to come in?" Preston shook his head. "Better not. Wouldn't be proper, and folks notice everything on a ranch." He held out a package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something that might help with your teaching." Grace accepted the package and carefully unwrapped it to reveal 3 books: a comprehensive grammar text, an advanced mathematics book, and a volume of world history. "These are wonderful," she said, genuinely touched. "Where did you find them?" "Had them in my personal library," Preston explained. "Thought they might be useful references for the older students." Grace ran her fingers over the well-worn spines. "You've read these?" A hint of a smile crossed his face. "Winter nights get long in Colorado. Not much else to do but read when the snow's piled high." The image of this rugged rancher spending his evenings with books of history and mathematics added yet another layer to her understanding of him. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "This is incredibly thoughtful." Preston shifted slightly, seeming almost uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's nothing. Just want you to have what you need to succeed here." He paused, then added, "I notice young Tobias has taken an interest in you." The change of subject surprised Grace. "He was just being friendly, I think." "Tobias is a good hand, reliable," Preston said neutrally. "His father owns the mercantile in town." Grace wasn't sure how to interpret this information. Was Preston encouraging Tobias's interest? The thought brought an unexpected pang of disappointment. "I'm focused on establishing the school right now," she said carefully. "Social considerations are secondary." Something flickered in Preston's eyes, relief. "Wise approach," he said. "Well, I'll let you get back to your preparations. Good night, Grace." "Good night, Preston." As she watched him walk away, straight-backed and solitary in the gathering dusk, Grace wondered about the complexity of this man who had rescued her from auction, given her a home and purpose, yet remained so guarded with his own thoughts and feelings. The weekend passed in a flurry of preparation. Grace arranged the schoolhouse to her satisfaction, created a curriculum plan for each age group, and met more of her future students. By Monday morning, she felt as ready as possible for her first day of teaching at Dawson Ranch. She arrived at the schoolhouse early, wanting everything to be perfect. To her surprise, a vase of wildflowers sat on her desk: columbines, paintbrush, and wild asters arranged simply but beautifully. No note accompanied them, but Grace had a suspicion about their source. The school bell rang out across the ranch at 8 o'clock sharp, and children began streaming in, dressed in their cleanest clothes, hair neatly combed. Parents accompanied the youngest ones, offering shy introductions before departing. Grace stood at the front of the room, surveying the 27 eager and nervous faces before her. They represented the future of this community, the next generation of ranchers, farmers, merchants, and perhaps even teachers. The responsibility was sobering but exhilarating. "Good morning," she began, smiling warmly. "I'm Miss Williams, and I'm honored to be your teacher. We're going to learn many things together this year, but first, I'd like to learn about you." As the morning progressed, Grace assessed each child's abilities and assigned appropriate work. The older students helped the younger ones, creating a collaborative atmosphere that Grace encouraged. By the midday break, she had a much clearer understanding of the educational challenges and opportunities before her. The children ate their packed lunches under the trees outside, while Grace remained in the schoolhouse, making notes and adjustments to her plans. A shadow in the doorway made her look up. Preston stood there, his tall frame silhouetted against the bright sunlight. "How's it going?" he asked simply. "Wonderfully," Grace replied with genuine enthusiasm. "They're bright children, eager to learn. Some need more foundational work than others, but all of them have potential." Preston entered the room, looking around at the changes. She had made educational charts on the walls, books organized by level, a map of the United States prominently displayed. "You've transformed the place," he observed. "The flowers were a lovely touch," Grace said, watching his reaction. "Thank you." Preston's eyes widened slightly in surprise, then he gave a small nod, neither confirming nor denying. "Just wanted to make sure you have everything you need." "I do," Grace assured him, "though I've been thinking about adding some hands-on lessons. Perhaps visits to different parts of the ranch to learn about cattle raising, blacksmithing, even basic veterinary care. Practical knowledge to complement book learning." "Good idea," Preston agreed, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. Education should prepare them for real life, not just fill their heads with facts they'll never use. "Exactly." Grace was pleased by his understanding. "Would you be willing to help arrange those kinds of experiences?" "Of course. Whatever you need." He hesitated, then added, "I was thinking we might have a social gathering this Saturday. Sort of a proper welcome for you now that you've settled in. Nothing fancy, just music, some dancing, food." The invitation surprised Grace. From what she had learned, Preston rarely initiated social events. "That sounds lovely," she said, "but please don't go to any trouble on my account." "No trouble. The ranch folk could use some fun. Been a while since we had cause to celebrate." Something in his expression softened as he looked at her. "Your coming here has been good for the community already. The children haven't stopped talking about school since you arrived." Before Grace could respond, the children began returning from lunch, their chatter announcing their approach. Preston tipped his hat to her. "I'll let you get back to your teaching. We can discuss the social details later." The afternoon session went as smoothly as the morning. By the time Grace rang the dismissal bell, she felt a deep satisfaction with her first day. As the children filed out, several parents arrived to hear about their progress. Mrs. Freeman lingered after the others had gone. "Miss Williams, I wanted to thank you personal-like," she said earnestly. "My Josephine came home at midday just bursting with excitement about the history lesson. She's never cared much for book learning before." "Josephine has a quick mind," Grace replied. "She asked excellent questions about the Revolution. With encouragement, she could become a fine scholar." Mrs. Freeman's eyes glistened with tears. "That means the world to hear. Her pa and I never had proper schooling, but we want better for our children." After Mrs. Freeman left, Grace remained in the quiet schoolhouse, savoring the peaceful aftermath of a successful day. Through the window, she could see Preston by the main corral, deep in conversation with his foreman. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up toward the schoolhouse, then raised his hand in a brief salute. Grace returned the gesture, feeling a curious warmth spread through her chest. In just a few days, this place had begun to feel like home, and its people like family. And at the center of it all was the enigmatic rancher who had fought for her freedom and given her a new beginning. As she gathered her materials to return to her cabin, Grace wondered what Saturday's social would bring. Despite her focus on establishing herself as a teacher, she couldn't deny the growing interest she felt in Preston Dawson, an interest that seemed to extend beyond gratitude for his kindness. The thought both thrilled and frightened her. After all she had been through, could she really trust her heart to another? And even if she could, Was Preston interested in anything more than ensuring the ranch had a competent teacher? These questions followed Grace back to her cabin, as the setting sun painted the Colorado sky in magnificent hues of orange and purple. Whatever the answers might be, she was beginning to believe that her forced journey west might have been the best thing that ever happened to her. The rest of Grace's first week of teaching passed in a satisfying rhythm of lessons, getting to know her students and becoming more integrated into ranch life. Each day brought new challenges and rewards as she adjusted her teaching methods to suit the diverse needs of her pupils. By Friday afternoon, word of the Saturday social had spread throughout the ranch community, creating a buzz of excitement. Grace discovered that such gatherings were relatively rare at Dawson Ranch, usually limited to major holidays and special occasions. "Mr. Dawson ain't much for frivolity," Mrs. Callahan explained as she showed Grace how to make proper biscuits in the main house kitchen. "But when he does decide to have a celebration, he does it proper." "I hope people don't go to too much trouble," Grace said, carefully cutting dough with the rim of a glass as instructed. Mrs. Callahan chuckled. "Trouble? Child, these folks are starved for entertainment. The men have been practicing their instruments all week, and the women are baking enough pies to feed an army. It's good for everyone to have something to look forward to." As Grace walked back to her cabin that evening, she noticed increased activity around the ranch. Men were setting up tables near the creek where the gathering would be held. Women hung lanterns from tree branches, creating what would be a magical effect after dark. When she reached her cabin, Grace found a package waiting on her doorstep. Inside was a dress not new, but beautifully made of deep green cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. A note in unfamiliar feminine handwriting reads simply, "Every teacher needs a proper party dress. The ladies of Dawson Ranch." Touched by the gesture, Grace tried on the dress and found it fit remarkably well with only minor adjustments needed. The color complemented her brown hair and eyes, and the style, while simpler than Boston fashion, was flattering and practical for frontier life. Saturday dawned clear and perfect. After completing some school preparations, Grace spent the afternoon helping with final arrangements for the social. Women laid out food on long tables while men set up a wooden platform for dancing. Children darted about with excitement, their chores completed early for the special occasion. Preston was notably absent for most of the day, having ridden out at dawn with several hands to check on distant cattle. Grace found herself watching for his return, a fact that did not go unnoticed by the observant Mrs. Callahan. "He'll be back in time," the housekeeper assured her with a knowing smile. Man wouldn't miss his own party. As the afternoon waned, Grace returned to her cabin to prepare. She bathed using the precious soap she had brought from Boston, then carefully dressed in the green gown. Her hair, usually confined in a practical braid, she arranged in a more elaborate style, with soft tendrils framing her face. Looking in her small mirror, Grace hardly recognized herself. The past week of fresh air, good food, and purposeful work had brought color to her cheeks and a brightness to her eyes that had been absent during her ordeal in Aspen. The sound of music drifted on the evening breeze as Grace made her way toward the creek. Lanterns glowed among the trees, casting a warm light over the gathering. Tables laden with food lined one side of the clearing, while the makeshift dance floor occupied the center. Several men played fiddles, guitars, and a harmonica, creating lively tunes that had children already skipping in circles. Grace's arrival caused a momentary lull in conversations as people turned to greet her. The warmth of their welcome still surprised her. These people who had been strangers just a week ago now treated her like one of their own. "Miss Williams, you look lovely," Mrs. Freeman called, approaching with a cup of punch. "The green suits you beautifully." "Thank you for the dress," Grace replied. "It was such a thoughtful gift." "We're just glad to have you here," Mrs. Miller added, joining them. "The children talk of nothing but school now. My Henry actually asked for help with his letters last night, a miracle if ever there was one." As Grace circulated through the gathering, accepting compliments and engaging in conversation, she couldn't help noticing that Preston had still not arrived. Despite the festive atmosphere and genuine enjoyment of the company, she felt a pang of disappointment. The musicians struck up a lively reel and several couples took to the dance floor. Young Tobias approached Grace, his hair slicked down with water and his best shirt only slightly wrinkled. "Would you honor me with a dance, Miss Williams?" he asked, his freckled face earnest. Grace hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd be delighted, Tobias." The dance was energetic and required concentration, leaving little room for conversation. Grace found herself genuinely enjoying the music and movement after weeks of stress and uncertainty. When the song ended, Tobias led her back to the edge of the clearing, his chest puffed with pride at having secured the first dance with the teacher. Before he could ask for another, the crowd's attention shifted toward the path from the ranch buildings. Preston had arrived, accompanied by his foreman. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance, his usually practical attire replaced by a clean dark shirt, vest, and trousers. His hair was damp from a recent washing, and he had trimmed his beard. Grace felt her heart quicken as his eyes scanned the gathering, finally coming to rest on her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the lantern-lit clearing. Then Preston began making his way toward her, stopping frequently to exchange words with ranch residents. "Evening, Miss Williams," he said when he finally reached her, his deep voice sending an inexplicable shiver down her spine. "I apologize for being late to your welcome celebration." "It's your celebration, Mr. Dawson," she corrected gently. "I'm merely the excuse for it." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Perhaps we can share the honor." His eyes took in her appearance, lingering briefly on the green dress. "You look different tonight. It suits you." Coming from another man, the awkward compliment might have seemed inadequate, but from Preston, with his usual economy of words, it felt significant. "Thank you," Grace replied. "You clean up rather well yourself." This time his smile was fuller, transforming his serious features. High praise from a Boston lady. The musicians began a slower tune and Preston glanced toward the dance floor. "Would you care to dance, Grace? I'm not particularly skilled, but I can manage to stay off your toes." "I'd like that," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Preston led her to the dance floor with a surprising grace for a man who spent most of his time on horseback. His hand at her waist was respectful yet firm, his other hand holding hers with careful precision. Despite his disclaimer, he moved with confidence, guiding her through the steps of the waltz. "Where did you learn to dance?" Grace asked, genuinely curious about this new facet of the rancher. "My mother insisted," Preston replied, steering her smoothly around another couple. "Said no son of hers would grow up without knowing how to properly escort a lady at a social function." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was." A shadow passed over his face. "Lost her when I was 16. Influenza." Grace remembered what Mrs. Miller had told her about Preston's past, another loss to the same disease that had taken his intended wife years later. "I'm sorry. I lost my mother 5 years ago. It leaves a hole that never quite fills." Preston's eyes met hers with understanding. "No, it doesn't. But life continues, and eventually, the good memories outweigh the pain." They danced in comfortable silence for a few moments, each lost in thought. Grace was acutely aware of his proximity, the strength in his hand at her waist, the clean scent of soap and leather that surrounded him. "I want to thank you again," she said suddenly. "Not just for the rescue at the auction, but for everything since. You've given me more than a job and shelter. You've given me a community, a purpose." Preston's expression softened. "You've earned your place here, Grace. The children are thriving under your teaching, and the parents can't stop singing your praises." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "Having you here has brought something back to the ranch that was missing, a kind of hope." The word hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond its simple syllable. The music drew to a close, but neither moved immediately to separate. "Mr. Dawson," called one of the ranch hands, breaking the moment, "we need your judgment on a friendly wager about last year's cattle drive." Preston released Grace reluctantly. "Duty calls. Save another dance for me later." "I will," she promised. As he walked away, Grace became aware of several women watching her with knowing expressions. Rather than feeling embarrassed, she found herself smiling. There was something refreshingly honest about ranch life. People spoke their minds, and didn't hide their feelings behind layers of social pretense, as they did in Boston society. The evening continued with more dancing, abundant food, and the sharing of stories around the fire that was lit as darkness fell completely. Grace danced with several of the ranch hands, and even with some of the older boys from her school, who executed their steps with careful concentration. Throughout it all, she remained aware of Preston's presence. He moved through the gathering with the quiet authority that seemed natural to him, speaking with everyone, ensuring all were enjoying themselves. Occasionally their eyes would meet across the clearing, and a silent communication would pass between them. Later, as promised, they danced again. This time the tune was livelier, requiring more movement and less conversation. Grace found herself laughing as Preston twirled her, his usual reserve giving way to genuine enjoyment. When the dance ended, Preston didn't release her hand immediately. "Would you walk with me for a moment?" he asked, nodding toward the path that led along the creek. "There's something I'd like to show you." Aware of curious eyes, Grace nonetheless nodded. "I'd like that." They strolled away from the gathering, the sounds of music and laughter fading slightly as they followed the moonlit path. Fireflies blinked among the trees, adding to the magical quality of the evening. "I found this place when I first came to the valley," Preston said as they rounded a bend in the creek. "It helped me decide this was where I wanted to build my ranch." The path opened onto a small clearing where the creek widened into a pool. The full moon reflected perfectly on its surface, surrounded by the silhouettes of mountains against the star-filled sky. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, enchanted by the peaceful scene. "I come here sometimes when I need to think," Preston admitted. Not many know about it. The fact that he would share this personal retreat with her felt significant. They stood side by side in comfortable silence, watching the occasional ripple disturb the moon's reflection when a fish rose to the surface. "Grace," Preston said finally, his voice low and serious, "I need to tell you something." She turned to face him, her heart suddenly racing. "Yes." "When I saw you on that auction block in Aspen, I was there by chance. Had some business with the bank, heard the commotion at the fair." His eyes held hers steadily. "I've seen some terrible things in my life during the war and after, but something about seeing you there being sold like property. It struck me in a way nothing has in years." Grace swallowed hard, remembering the humiliation and fear of that moment. "It was the lowest point of my life." "You held yourself with dignity even then," Preston said softly. "I didn't plan to intervene, wasn't looking for trouble. But I couldn't walk away." "Why are you telling me this now?" Grace asked, though something in her already knew the answer. Preston took a deep breath. "Because I want you to know that while I brought you here to teach, That's not the only reason anymore. These past days, watching you with the children, seeing how you've embraced ranch life, getting to know you." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I find myself thinking about you in ways that go beyond employer and teacher." The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable from a man who rarely revealed his feelings. "Preston," Grace said carefully, "I'm deeply grateful for everything you've done." He shook his head, interrupting gently. "This isn't about gratitude, Grace. I don't want your thanks. I just want you to know where I stand. I have no expectations. You've been through a terrible ordeal and you're still finding your footing here. The last thing you need is pressure from me." His consideration touched her deeply. In Boston, men of her acquaintance had often pursued their interests with little regard for her feelings or circumstances. "What if I told you," Grace said slowly, "that I've been thinking about you too? That despite everything that's happened, or perhaps because of it, I find myself drawn to you in ways I hadn't anticipated." The moonlight revealed the hope that flared in Preston's eyes. "I'd say we should take things slowly, get to know each other properly. No rush, no pressure." Grace smiled, appreciating his measured approach. "I'd like that." Preston reached out hesitantly, taking her hand in his. The contact was simple but profound, a physical acknowledgement of the connection growing between them. "We should return to the party," he said after a moment, "before Mrs. Callahan sends out a search party." Grace laughed softly. "She does seem to have appointed herself our chaperone." They walked back toward the gathering, still hand in hand, both aware that this evening marked a turning point in their relationship. Whatever might develop between them would unfold naturally, with the time and space needed after all they had both endured. As they rejoined the celebration, several knowing looks were exchanged among the ranch residents, but no comments were made. In this close community, private matters were respected even when observed. The party continued for several more hours, with Grace and Preston participating separately in dances and conversations, yet always aware of each other's presence. When the gathering finally began to disperse, families heading to their cabins with tired children in tow, Preston walked Grace to her door. "Thank you for the celebration," she said as they reached her cabin. "It was a wonderful evening." "Thank you for giving us a reason to celebrate," he replied. Then, with formal courtesy that spoke of his upbringing, he raised her hand to his lips for a brief moment. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Preston." As he walked away toward the main house, Grace stood in her doorway, watching his retreating figure. The evening had brought revelations and possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine a week ago. Standing under the vast Colorado sky, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope for a future bright with promise, and perhaps, in time, love. The weeks following the social gathering brought subtle but significant changes to life at Dawson Ranch. While Grace and Preston maintained proper decorum in public, their growing connection was evident to the observant community around them. Preston began taking his evening meals with Grace and Mrs. Callahan in the main house, rather than alone in his study. He made regular visits to the schoolhouse, often bringing books or supplies he thought might be useful. For her part, Grace found herself looking forward to these interactions with increasing anticipation. Her teaching continued to thrive as she implemented innovative approaches that combined traditional learning with practical ranch knowledge. The children responded enthusiastically, their progress exceeding even her optimistic expectations. September gave way to October, bringing crisp mornings and the first hints of gold in the aspen leaves. Ranch activities shifted toward preparation for winter. Hay was stored, buildings repaired, food preserved. Grace incorporated these seasonal tasks into her lessons, having the children calculate hay requirements for cattle or write essays about the changing landscape. One cool Saturday afternoon, Preston invited Grace to ride with him to a distant part of the ranch she hadn't yet seen. After ensuring Mrs. Callahan knew of their plans, a concession to propriety they both understood was necessary. They set out on horseback. Grace had grown more comfortable riding, though she still lacked Preston's natural ease in the saddle. He had provided her with a gentle mare named Daisy, patient with an inexperienced rider. "Where exactly are we going?" Grace asked as they rode side by side along a well-worn trail. "There's a homestead on the northwest corner of my property," Preston explained. "Been abandoned for years, but the apple orchard still produces. Thought we might collect some for Mrs. Callahan's pies." The ride took them through stunning fall scenery, meadows turned golden in the autumn sun, groves of aspens shimmering with yellow leaves, pine-covered slopes rising toward the distant peaks. Preston pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the valley's early settlement. "The first white family came through here in '59 during the gold rush," he told her. "Decided farming looked more promising than mining. They were right." "What about the native people?" Grace asked. "Were there conflicts?" Preston nodded soberly. "The Ute had summer hunting grounds in this valley. There was trouble at first, raids and reprisals. By the time I arrived, most had been forced onto reservations." His expression grew thoughtful. "Can't say I'm proud of how that was handled. Try to maintain good relations with those who still pass through occasionally." Grace appreciated his honesty about a difficult subject. It reflected the moral complexity she had come to recognize in him, a man shaped by his time and place, yet thoughtful enough to question accepted practices. After about an hour's ride, they crested a small rise and the homestead came into view. The cabin was weathered but still standing, its log walls gray with age. Behind it, as Preston had described, stood an orchard of gnarled apple trees heavy with fruit. "It's lovely," Grace said as they dismounted. "Who lived here?" "Family named Carter," Preston replied, securing their horses to a hitching post that still stood before the cabin. "Husband died in a hunting accident. Widow tried to make a go of it alone but eventually moved to town. I bought the land from her 5 years ago. Keep meaning to fix up the cabin for a line shack, but haven't gotten around to it." They approached the orchard with canvas bags Preston had brought for collecting apples. The trees, though untended, were productive, their branches bending with the weight of red and golden fruit. "These will make wonderful pies," Grace said, reaching for a perfectly ripe apple. "And we could use some for the children to study. Perhaps press cider as a lesson in simple machines." Preston smiled at her enthusiasm. "Always the teacher." "Always," she agreed happily. "It's who I am." They worked companionably, collecting the best apples and sharing occasional conversation. The afternoon sun warmed the orchard despite the autumn chill, and the scent of ripe fruit filled the air. "Tell me about your family," Grace said as they worked. "You've mentioned your parents, but did you have siblings?" Preston nodded, his expression softening with memory. "2 sisters, both younger. Elizabeth lives in Denver with her husband and 3 children. Martha married a Navy man and lives in San Francisco. Don't see them as often as I'd like. You must miss them." "I do. They write regularly, though. Elizabeth keeps threatening to visit and find me a proper wife." He glanced at Grace with a hint of humor. "Seems to think I need help in that department." The casual mention of marriage between them sent a flutter through Grace's stomach. "And what do you tell her?" Preston's eyes held hers steadily. "I used to tell her I was too busy building a ranch to worry about such things. Lately, I've been less certain that's true." The moment hung between them, weighted with possibility. Grace felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. What about your family?" Preston asked, giving her space to collect herself. "Any siblings?" Grace shook her head. "I was an only child. My mother always wanted more children, but it wasn't to be. Perhaps that's why she was so devoted to education. All her maternal energy went into teaching me and her students." "She sounds remarkable." She was. Father was more practical, focused on his business, providing a comfortable life. After she died, he seemed to lose his purpose. Grace sighed, remembering her father's decline. "I wonder sometimes if I could have done more to help him." Preston moved closer, his expression gentle. "We can't save people from themselves, Grace. Believe me, I've learned that lesson the hard way." Something in his tone suggested personal experience beyond what he'd shared about his past. Grace wondered about the shadows that occasionally crossed his face but didn't press. He would tell her in his own time if he wanted to. Their bags full of apples. They spread a blanket Preston had brought and sat beneath one of the larger trees to rest before the ride back. Preston produced a small bundle from his saddlebag: bread, cheese, and a jar of preserved peaches from Mrs. Callahan's pantry. "You planned a picnic," Grace observed, delighted by the thoughtfulness. "Thought you might be hungry after our work," he said simply, though the slight color in his cheeks revealed his pleasure at her reaction. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the peaceful setting and each other's company. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, occasionally sending one spiraling down to land on their blanket. "Winter comes early in the mountains," Preston said, gazing at the distant peaks where snow already glistened. "Another month and we could have snow even down here." "Will the school continue through winter?" Grace asked. Preston nodded. "That's the plan. The schoolhouse has a good stove and most of the children can walk there even in snow. Might have some days when the younger ones can't make it, but we try to keep learning going year-round." "I'm glad." "Consistency is important for education." Grace hesitated, then asked a question that had been on her mind. "Preston, what happens when my 6-month teaching contract ends?" He looked at her directly, his expression serious. "That depends entirely on you, Grace. The position is yours for as long as you want it. I hope you'll stay, but I understand if you eventually want to return east or seek opportunities in a larger town." The thought of leaving the ranch, of leaving Preston, created an unexpected ache in Grace's chest. "I have no desire to return east," she said softly. "As for other opportunities, I'm finding everything I need right here." Preston's hand found hers on the blanket, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "I'm glad to hear that. The ranch wouldn't be the same without you now." The simple touch and honest words conveyed more than elaborate declarations might have. Grace understood that for a man like Preston, actions spoke louder than words, and his actions consistently showed his growing feelings for her. They remained at the homestead until the afternoon began to wane, talking about ranch plans, school projects, and gradually, more personal hopes and dreams. As the sun dipped toward the mountains, they reluctantly packed up their apples and the picnic remnants for the ride home. The return journey was quieter, both lost in thoughts about their deepening relationship. The ranch came into view just as twilight settled over the valley, the windows of the main house and cabins glowing with welcoming light. As they approached the stables, several ranch hands came out to greet them and help with the horses. Grace noticed the men's respectful treatment of Preston and their friendly, if slightly teasing, manner with her. "Had a nice ride, Miss Williams?" asked Jim, one of the older hands, as he took Daisy's reins. "Lovely, thank you," she replied, aware that her flushed cheeks might reveal more than her words. Jim simply smiled and led the mare away, exchanging a knowing look with the other men that Grace pretended not to notice. Preston carried their bags of apples to the main house kitchen. where Mrs. Callahan exclaimed over the bounty with appropriate enthusiasm. After arranging to have some apples sent to the schoolhouse for Monday's lessons, Grace prepared to return to her cabin. "I'll walk you back," Preston said, in a tone that brooked no argument from Mrs. Callahan, who merely smiled and continued sorting apples. The night was clear and cool, the stars emerging in brilliant profusion above the ranch. Their path was lit by the silver moonlight and the golden glow from cabin windows. "Thank you for today," Grace said as they walked slowly toward her cabin. "It was wonderful to see more of the ranch." "Thank you for coming," Preston replied. "Your company made a simple task enjoyable." They reached her door too quickly. Grace turned to face him, suddenly reluctant for their time together to end. "Grace," Preston said, his voice lower and more intimate in the darkness, "I've been thinking." "Yes," she encouraged when he paused. "Would you allow me to court you properly? I know it's only been 2 months since you arrived, and perhaps it's too soon, but—" "It's not too soon," Grace interrupted gently. "And yes, I would like that very much." In the moonlight, she could see his expression transform with relief and happiness. Preston took her hand and raised it to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good night, then," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll see you tomorrow at Sunday dinner." "Good night, Preston." As she entered her cabin and lit her lamp, Grace felt a quiet joy spreading through her. 2 months ago, she had stood on an auction block, her future bleak and terrifying. Now she had a home, a purpose, a community, and the beginning of something precious with a man unlike any she had known before. Whatever challenges might lie ahead, Grace knew with growing certainty that her path had led exactly where it was meant to go. The courtship between Grace and Preston developed gradually over the following months, like a carefully tended seedling growing stronger with each passing day. Their relationship became a subtle backdrop to the rhythms of ranch life present in shared glances across the dining table, in Preston's regular visits to the schoolhouse, in Sunday afternoon rides that became a cherished tradition. Preston demonstrated his intentions through both actions and small gifts. One week, it might be a book of poetry he had ordered from Denver. The next, a handcrafted wooden box for her teaching supplies made during the long evening hours. Grace treasured these tokens not for their material value, but for the thought behind them. The ranch community observed their developing relationship with quiet approval. Many of the families had known Preston for years and had witnessed his solitary existence. They welcomed the change in the rancher, the more frequent smiles, the increased participation in community gatherings, the occasional moments of unguarded laughter. November brought the first significant snowfall, transforming the landscape into a glistening white expanse. Ranch activities shifted indoors where possible, though the essential work of caring for livestock continued regardless of weather. Preston and his men spent long hours ensuring the cattle had access to feed and unfrozen water, often returning to the warmth of the main house with ice in their beards and exhaustion in their eyes. Grace adjusted her teaching to accommodate winter conditions. On particularly harsh days when the youngest children couldn't make the journey to the schoolhouse, she assigned the older students independent work and visited the families with small children, bringing lessons and books. These home visits deepened her connection to the ranch families and provided insights into her students' lives that enriched her teaching. As Christmas approached, excitement grew among the children. Many had limited experience with elaborate holiday celebrations, as frontier life focused more on necessities than luxuries. Grace decided to organize a Christmas pageant that would combine education with festivity. "I'd like to have the children perform a program," she explained to Preston one evening as they sat by the fire in the main house. "Something with music, recitations, perhaps a simple nativity scene. Would you be willing to host it here for the families? Of course, Preston agreed readily. The main room can accommodate everyone if we move some furniture. When were you thinking? Christmas Eve. It would give everyone something special to anticipate, and we could follow with refreshments. Preston nodded thoughtfully. I'll need to ride into Aspen next week for supplies anyway. Is there anything specific you need for this pageant? Grace hesitated. Perhaps some simple fabric for costumes, and if the general store has any candy or oranges for the children. She stopped, concerned about asking too much. Preston smiled at her hesitation. Make a list of whatever you need. Christmas comes but once a year, and these children deserve some joy. The following weeks were filled with preparations. While maintaining regular lessons, Grace worked with the students on their performances. The older children memorized poetry and Bible verses, while the younger ones practiced Christmas carols. Mrs. Freeman, who had a talent for sewing, helped create simple costumes from the materials Preston brought from town. Preston himself seemed caught up in the holiday spirit, disappearing into his workshop for hours in the evenings. When Grace inquired about his project, he merely smiled mysteriously and changed the subject. On December 23rd, a heavy snowstorm blew in from the mountains, threatening to disrupt the Christmas Eve plans. Grace watched anxiously from her classroom window as white flakes swirled across the ranch yard, quickly accumulating on the ground. You think we'll need to cancel tomorrow's pageant? She asked Mrs. Miller, who had come to help with final preparations. The older woman smiled reassuringly. Takes more than snow to keep ranch folk from a celebration, especially at Christmas. If it stops by morning, the men will clear paths between the cabins and the main house. Don't you worry. As if in answer to prayers, the storm abated during the night. Grace awoke on Christmas Eve to a transformed world, pristine white snow blanketing the landscape, evergreens wearing heavy mantles of white, icicles glittering from eaves in the morning sun. True to Mrs. Miller's prediction, Preston and the ranch hands were already clearing paths when Grace emerged from her cabin. Preston looked up as she approached, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Morning," he called, leaning on his shovel. "Sleep well?" "Surprisingly, yes, despite the wind," Grace replied, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold. "This is beautiful, but I was worried about tonight." Preston's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Told you we don't let weather dictate our plans out here. Everything's on schedule. Mrs. Callahan's already baking up a storm, and I've got a surprise for the main house." "A surprise?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "Would this have anything to do with your mysterious evening activities?" "Might be," he acknowledged with a grin. "You'll see tonight." Throughout the day, excitement built across the ranch. Children made last-minute preparations for their performances, while adults finished holiday cooking and put on their best clothes. By late afternoon, lanterns illuminated the snow-covered paths leading to the main house. Grace arrived early to help arrange the space. She stopped in the doorway, astonished by the transformation. The large main room had been cleared of its usual furniture and decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. A magnificent fire roared in the stone fireplace, and on one side of the room stood a Christmas tree not large, but beautifully decorated with simple wooden ornaments, strings of dried berries and small candles ready to be lit. "Preston," she exclaimed as he emerged from his study. "It's wonderful." "Where did you find a tree?" "Cut it myself from the north slope," he said, clearly pleased by her reaction. "The ornaments are what I've been working on evenings." Grace moved closer to examine the tree. Each wooden ornament had been carved with remarkable detail: stars, angels, animals of the Nativity. "You made these. They're beautiful." "My father taught me whittling when I was a boy," Preston explained. Haven't done much of it in recent years, but it came back to me. The effort he had put into creating this Christmas surprise touched Grace deeply. Before she could express her appreciation, families began arriving, the children's excited voices filling the room. The Christmas Eve pageant exceeded even Grace's hopes. The children performed their pieces with enthusiasm, if not always precision. Joseph Freeman, playing a shepherd, forgot his lines but improvised admirably. The youngest Garcia child, cast as a lamb, refused to remove her costume even for refreshments afterward. Throughout the evening, Grace watched Preston interacting with the ranch families, helping a young boy light a candle on the tree, complimenting Mrs. Freeman on the costumes, ensuring everyone had enough to eat. This was a side of him rarely displayed in daily ranch operations, warm, paternal, completely at ease. After the formal program ended, one of the ranch hands brought out a fiddle, and another produced a harmonica. Impromptu dancing began, with children skipping in circles and adults joining in more organized patterns. Preston made his way to Grace's side as she watched the festivities. "Your pageant was a great success," he said warmly. "Look how happy everyone is." Grace gazed around the room at the flushed, smiling faces. "It's wonderful to see. Thank you for making it possible." "I have something for you," Preston said, his voice lower. "Not to be given publicly. Would you step into my study for a moment?" Curious, Grace followed him to the small room adjacent to the main area. Unlike the rest of the house, which reflected the practical necessities of ranch life, Preston's study revealed more of the man himself. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on a wide range of subjects. A solid desk faced the window with its view of the mountains. Above the desk hung a portrait of a handsome couple, Preston's parents, she presumed. Preston closed the door partially, ensuring propriety while creating privacy from the noise of the celebration. From his desk drawer, he withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Merry Christmas, Grace," he said, handing it to her. Grace carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she discovered it was a journal, its pages blank except for an inscription on the first page in Preston's neat handwriting. "For Grace, that you might record your new beginnings. With deepest affection, Preston." "It's perfect," she said, genuinely touched by the thoughtful gift. "Thank you. I noticed you writing lesson plans on whatever paper you could find," he explained. "Thought you might like something more permanent." "I have something for you as well," Grace said, reaching into her pocket, "though it seems humble in comparison." She handed him a small package, watching nervously as he unwrapped it. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "Mrs. Callahan taught me," Grace explained quickly. "I'm not very skilled yet, but it's excellent," Preston interrupted, running his fingers over the wool. "No one has made something like this for me since my mother." He wrapped the scarf around his neck immediately. "How does it look?" "Very handsome," Grace replied honestly. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of celebration muffled by the partially closed door. Preston moved slightly closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Grace," he said softly, "these past months have been the happiest I can remember in years. Having you here, getting to know you, it's changed everything." "For me as well," she responded, her heart beating faster. "When I think of where I was when we met and where I am now." "You've flourished because of your own strength and spirit," Preston said firmly. "I just provided the opportunity." "You provided much more than that," Grace countered. "You gave me safety when I was vulnerable, purpose when I was lost, friendship when I was alone." She hesitated, then added more softly, "And something else I wasn't expecting to find again, hope for the future." Preston reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. I'd like to be part of that future, Grace, not just as your employer or friend, but as more. The moment seemed suspended in time, the soft glow of the lamp, the distant music and laughter, the warmth of Preston's hands around hers. Grace felt no hesitation, only a certainty that had been growing steadily since that day by the creek. "I'd like that too," she whispered. Preston's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle yet full of promise. Grace responded with equal tenderness, her free hand coming to rest lightly on his chest. The kiss lasted only a moment before Preston drew back slightly, his eyes searching hers. What he saw there must have reassured him, for he smiled again and squeezed her hand. "We should rejoin the others," he said reluctantly, "before they notice our absence." Grace nodded, though part of her wished they could remain in this private moment longer. "Yes, you're right." As they returned to the main room, Grace noticed Mrs. Callahan watching them with a knowing smile but saying nothing. The celebration continued for several more hours, with stories told around the fire, more music and generous servings of Mrs. Callahan's special Christmas punch. When the evening finally wound down, families departing with sleepy children in tow, Preston walked Grace back to her cabin as had become their custom. The night was clear and bitterly cold, stars brilliant in the black sky, their path illuminated by lantern light reflected on snow. At her door, Preston took both her hands in his. "Merry Christmas, Grace. Merry Christmas, Preston." He kissed her again, this time with slightly more assurance, before reluctantly saying good night. As Grace watched him walk back toward the main house, she touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the gentle pressure of his kiss. Inside her cabin, she sat on her bed and opened the journal Preston had given her. For a long time, she simply stared at the blank pages, thinking about all that had happened since that terrible day at the county fair. Finally, she picked up a pencil and began to write. Christmas Eve, 1875. Today marks the beginning of something precious. When I came to Colorado, I thought my life was ending. Instead, I found a new beginning. Winter settled over Dawson Ranch with a fierce intensity, bringing snowstorms that sometimes confined residents to their homes for days at a time. Yet amid the harsh weather, life continued with surprising warmth and vitality. The community drew closer together, sharing resources and companionship through the long, cold months. For Grace, the winter brought both challenges and joys. Teaching required extra creativity during periods when attendance was irregular due to weather. She organized learning materials for home study and utilized every clear day to its fullest potential. Her relationship with Preston deepened as they found more occasions to be together. With outdoor work limited by weather, Preston spent more evenings in the main house rather than riding the property. They established a routine of reading together by the fire after dinner, sometimes sharing passages from favorite books, other times simply enjoying quiet companionship. Their courtship proceeded with a deliberate pace that suited them both. Preston was unfailingly respectful, always mindful of Grace's position in the community as teacher. Public displays of affection were limited to the occasional hand-holding or brief touch, though in private moments, their embraces grew more confident. January brought a particularly vicious blizzard that isolated the ranch for nearly a week. When it finally abated, Preston and several hands had to dig paths between buildings and clear routes to the cattle in the sheltered winter pastures. Grace worried constantly during the long hours Preston spent in the dangerous cold, relieved each time he returned safely. One such evening, as Preston warmed himself by the kitchen fire after a grueling day, Grace brought him a cup of hot coffee. His hands were chapped and red despite heavy gloves, his face wind-burned from exposure. "You need to be more careful," she admonished gently, sitting beside him. "Frostbite is a serious risk in these conditions." Preston accepted the coffee gratefully. "Can't be helped. Animals depend on us, especially in weather like this." Grace studied his profile, noting the weariness around his eyes. "You take care of everyone and everything on this ranch." "Who takes care of you?" He looked at her then, his gaze softening. "I've managed on my own for a long time, Grace, though lately I've been wondering if that's still necessary." The implication of his words hung between them, unspoken but understood. Grace reached for his hand, her touch gentle on his weather-roughened skin. "Perhaps it's not." Their quiet moment was interrupted by Mrs. Callahan entering with a pot of stew, but the look they exchanged carried the conversation forward without words. February brought Valentine's Day, not traditionally celebrated with much fanfare on the frontier, but marked by small gestures among the ranch families. Grace organized a special activity for her students, having them create handmade cards with verses about friendship and family love. She was surprised when Preston appeared at the schoolhouse at day's end, waiting until the children had departed before approaching her desk. "I understand today has certain traditions associated with it," he said, a hint of color rising in his face that had nothing to do with the cold. From behind his back, he produced a small bunch of dried wildflowers tied with a ribbon. "They're not fresh, of course," he explained quickly. "Preserved them from last summer's meadow blooms. Mrs. Callahan showed me how." Grace accepted the simple bouquet, deeply touched by the effort it represented. "They're beautiful. I've never received a more thoughtful Valentine." From her desk, she withdrew a card similar to those the children had made but more elaborate, with a carefully penned verse from Elizabeth Barrett Browning inside. "I made this for you." Preston read the poem slowly, his expression growing more tender with each line. When he finished, he carefully tucked the card into his inner jacket pocket, directly over his heart. "I'll treasure this," he said simply. As February gave way to March, subtle signs of spring began to appear despite the snow that still blanketed the ground. Days lengthened noticeably, and the intense cold gradually moderated. Ranch activities began transitioning toward spring preparations. Fields would need plowing once the ground thawed, new calves would arrive soon, and buildings required repairs after the harsh winter weather. One Saturday in mid-March, Preston invited Grace to ride with him to check on a pregnant mare in the foaling barn some distance from the main ranch buildings. The day was relatively mild, the snow beginning to recede from south-facing slopes. The foaling barn was quiet and warm, with fresh straw bedding and the sweet smell of hay. The mare, a beautiful chestnut named Copper, greeted Preston with a soft nickering sound. He checked her condition with gentle expertise while explaining to Grace the signs that indicated birth was approaching. "She'll deliver within the week, I'd guess," he concluded, patting the mare's neck affectionately. "First foal of the season, always a hopeful sign." As they sat on a hay bale sharing the lunch Mrs. Callahan had packed, Grace reflected on how much she had learned about ranch life in these months. What had once seemed foreign and intimidating now felt familiar, even natural. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "How different my life is from what I imagined a year ago," she replied honestly. "In Boston, I thought teaching was my only calling. Now I see it as part of a much larger life." Preston nodded, understanding. The East and West shape people differently. Here, you can't survive with just one skill or purpose. Everything connects: the land, the animals, the community. "I never expected to feel so at home in a place so unlike where I grew up," Grace admitted. "But I can hardly remember now what it was like to live in a city, surrounded by buildings instead of mountains." Preston studied her face carefully. "Do you ever regret coming west?" "Never," she answered without hesitation. "Not even considering how I arrived, everything that's happened since has been." She searched for the right word. A blessing, unexpected and profound. Something shifted in Preston's expression, a decision reached, a certainty found. He set aside their lunch and took her hands in his. "Grace," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I had planned to wait until spring was properly here with flowers blooming and all, had some speech prepared about new beginnings and growth." He smiled slightly. "But sitting here with you now, I can't think of a more perfect moment." Grace's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. "I love you," Preston said simply. "Not just for your kindness or intelligence or beauty, though you possess all those in abundance. I love you for how you face life with courage and grace, true to your name. I love how you've embraced this community, how you care for the children, how you've brought light back into my life when I thought those days were past." He released her hands only to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small wooden box beautifully carved with intertwining flowers. Opening it, he revealed a ring, a simple gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "This was my mother's," he explained. "My father gave it to her when they decided to venture west together, leaving everything familiar behind for an uncertain future." He took a deep breath. "Grace Williams, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Will you build a future with me here, share my home, my name, my life?" Tears of joy filled Grace's eyes as she looked at the man before her, strong yet gentle, principled yet compassionate. A man who had fought for her freedom and then given her the space to find her own path. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Preston. With all my heart, yes." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if always meant to be there. He leaned forward to kiss her, conveying through his embrace all the love and promise contained in their commitment to each other. When they finally parted, both smiling through tears, Preston kept her hands in his. "I should warn you," he said with gentle humor, "Mrs. Callahan has been planning our wedding since about 2 days after you arrived. She may have some strong opinions on the matter." Grace laughed, joy bubbling up from deep within her. "I'll defer to her expertise, though I'd prefer not to wait too long." "Spring," Preston suggested. "When the ranch is green again and the worst of the mud season is past." "Perhaps May." "May would be perfect," Grace agreed. She looked down at the ring on her finger, still hardly believing this moment was real. "Will your sisters be able to come?" "I'll send telegrams tomorrow," Preston assured her. "Elizabeth, at least, will move heaven and earth to be here. She's been pestering me about you since my first letter mentioning the new teacher." They stayed in the foaling barn longer than planned, talking about their future together, practical matters of running the ranch, dreams of possibly expanding the school as the community grew, hopes for a family of their own someday. When they finally rode back to the main ranch, the afternoon was waning, the setting sun casting long shadows across the snow-patched ground. Mrs. Callahan took one look at them as they entered the kitchen and burst into tears of happiness, embracing Grace and even the startled Preston with uncharacteristic emotional display. "I knew it," she exclaimed. "Didn't I say the moment you brought her here that she was the one? Didn't I say so?" Preston exchanged an amused glance with Grace. "You might have mentioned it once or twice, Mrs. Callahan." News of their engagement spread through the ranch community with remarkable speed. By supper time, Families were arriving at the main house with congratulations and small gifts, a hand-embroidered pillowcase, a jar of precious honey saved from last summer, a carved wooden spoon for their future kitchen. Grace was overwhelmed by the genuine happiness their news generated. These people who had welcomed her as a teacher now embraced her as their rancher's future wife with wholehearted approval. That night, as Preston walked her to her cabin as usual, their relationship forever altered by the promises exchanged, Grace felt a sense of rightness that transcended all the difficulties that had brought her to this place. "I never imagined when I saw you on that auction platform that we'd end up here," Preston said softly as they stood by her door. "You looked so brave despite everything. It was what first drew me to you." "And I never imagined the man who fought for me that day would become the love of my life," Grace replied, reaching up to touch his face gently. "But now I can't imagine any other path." Preston kissed her once more before reluctantly saying good night. As Grace watched him walk away, his tall figure outlined against the starlit sky, she thought about the strange, terrible journey that had led her west. What had begun as the darkest moment of her life had transformed into something beautiful beyond imagining. Tomorrow would bring plans and preparations, decisions and announcements. But tonight, in the quiet of her cabin with the ring gleaming on her finger, Grace simply savored the joy of having found home not just in a place, but in a person. Spring arrived at Dawson Ranch in a gradual progression of melting snow, emerging grass, and lengthening days. The transformation of the landscape mirrored the changes in Grace's life as she prepared to become Preston's wife while continuing her teaching duties. News of their engagement generated reactions beyond the ranch. A congratulatory letter arrived from Preston's sister Elizabeth, promising her attendance at the wedding with her husband and children. From Martha in San Francisco came a package containing fine lace for Grace's wedding dress and a silver picture frame for their future home. More surprising was the response from Aspen. Several of Grace's students' parents rode into town to purchase supplies and returned with gossip that the schoolteacher who had once been sold at auction was now engaged to one of the territory's most successful ranchers. The story had apparently become something of a romantic legend, embellished with each telling. "They're saying Mr. Dawson fought 10 men to win you," Mrs. Freeman reported with amusement as she helped Grace measure fabric for curtains in what would become their marital home. "And that you've received offers from Denver society to tell your tale." Grace laughed at the exaggerations. "1 man, not 10. And the only offer I've received from Denver is from Preston's sister inviting us to visit after the wedding." April brought increased activity to the ranch as winter's enforced idleness gave way to spring planting, calving season, and repair work. Grace continued teaching while also preparing to move from her small cabin to the main house. Preston insisted she make whatever changes she desired to the living spaces. "This has been a bachelor's home too long," he told her as they toured the rooms one evening. "It should reflect your taste as well as mine." Grace approached the task with thoughtful consideration. The house was well built and handsome, with generous rooms and practical features suited to ranch life. Rather than major changes, she envisioned smaller touches: new curtains, colorful quilts, perhaps rearranging furniture to create more conversational groupings. "The house already has good bones," she explained to Preston. "It just needs a woman's touch to soften some edges." The only significant change was the conversion of a rarely used guest room into a private sitting room for Grace, with bookshelves, a comfortable chair, and a desk where she could continue her educational planning even after marriage. "You'll need your own space," Preston insisted. somewhere to retreat when ranch business overtakes the rest of the house. His consideration touched Grace deeply. Unlike many men who might expect their wives to adapt entirely to their established ways, Preston actively sought to incorporate her needs and preferences into their shared future. As May approached, wedding preparations intensified. The ceremony would take place at the ranch, with a visiting minister from Aspen officiating. Mrs. Callahan coordinated a feast that would feed the entire ranch community, plus guests from neighboring properties and town. Grace's wedding dress was created through a community effort. Mrs. Freeman, with her skilled needlework, took the lead in design and construction. Several other women contributed details: hand-sewn lace trim, tiny pearl buttons saved from a treasured garment, embroidery on the collar. The result was a gown of ivory cotton with elegant simplicity that suited both the occasion and Grace's personal taste. 2 weeks before the wedding, Elizabeth Dawson arrived with her husband and 3 children. Her resemblance to Preston was striking: the same blue eyes and determined chin, though her manner was more openly expressive than her reserved brother. Elizabeth embraced Grace warmly upon introduction. "I knew from Preston's letters that you were special," she declared. "But now that I've met you, I understand completely. You've brought my serious brother back to life." With Elizabeth came a whirlwind of additional wedding preparations and family stories that gave Grace deeper insight into Preston's earlier life. In the evenings, the expanded household gathered in the main room, with Elizabeth frequently teasing Preston about childhood incidents or extracting promises about future visits. "You must come to Denver for Christmas," she insisted. "The children should know their new aunt properly, and I want to show Grace the city." Preston glanced at Grace, deferring to her preference. "We'll consider it," she promised, "though I can't imagine Christmas anywhere but here after last year's celebration." The week before the wedding, Preston surprised Grace by taking her to the small clearing by the creek pool, the spot he had shown her during the social many months ago. "I have something to show you," he said mysteriously, leading her along the familiar path now bordered with spring wildflowers. When they reached the clearing, Grace gasped in surprise. A small cabin stood where none had been before, new logs gleaming in the sunshine. It was not large, just one room with a covered porch facing the water, but beautifully crafted with careful attention to detail. "When did you build this?" she asked, amazed that such a project had escaped her notice. "Started it in winter, whenever weather permitted," Preston explained, leading her to the door. "The men helped when they could. We finished last week while you were busy with Elizabeth." Inside, the cabin was simply but comfortably furnished with a bed, a small table and chairs, a cast-iron stove, and bookshelves already stocked with some of their favorite volumes. "A retreat," Preston explained, watching her reaction closely. "Somewhere just for us, away from ranch business and responsibilities. Somewhere we can come to be alone together, especially in those first months of marriage when we're adjusting to our new life." The thoughtfulness of the gift overwhelmed Grace. This man, who had seemed so stoic when she first met him, had revealed himself to be deeply romantic in his own practical way, anticipating her needs even before she recognized them herself. "It's perfect," she said, turning to embrace him. "Absolutely perfect." The evening before their wedding, as traditions dictated they spend apart, Preston took Grace's hands in his as they said goodnight. "Tomorrow can't come soon enough," he said softly. "I keep thinking about that day at the county fair, how close I came to riding past without stopping, how different both our lives would have been." "I believe we were meant to find each other," Grace replied, "through whatever strange path life took to bring us together." Preston kissed her gently. "Sleep well, Grace Williams. Tomorrow you become Grace Dawson." "I can hardly wait," she whispered. Their wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, as if nature itself blessed their union. The ranch was transformed with flowers and ribbons, the barn cleared for dancing, tables set up under the trees for the wedding feast. In the main house, Elizabeth and the ranch women helped Grace prepare. Her hair was arranged in a crown of braids interwoven with small white flowers. The wedding dress, when she finally put it on, drew exclamations of approval from everyone. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Callahan declared, uncharacteristic tears in her eyes, "like you stepped out of a picture book." Outside, guests had begun to arrive, neighboring ranchers and their families, townspeople from Aspen, even a few travelers who happened to be passing through, and were invited to join the celebration in frontier tradition. At precisely noon, Grace walked from the main house toward the area by the creek where Preston waited with the minister. Ranch children had scattered flower petals along her path, and someone played a violin in the distance. Elizabeth preceded her, and Mrs. Callahan's youngest granddaughter followed, carrying the rings on a small cushion. When Grace reached the creekside, she saw Preston standing tall and handsome in a new dark suit, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to wonder as she approached. Beside him stood his brother-in-law as best man, and gathered around them were all the people who had become her community. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices strong and clear in the spring air. When Preston placed his mother's ring back on Grace's finger, now joined by a matching wedding band, his hand trembled slightly with emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Preston's kiss was tender yet possessive, a promise of the life they would build together. The gathering erupted in cheers and applause, celebrating a union that seemed meant to be from the moment a determined cowboy had stepped forward at a county fair and declared he would win a woman's freedom with his hands, not his coins. The celebration continued throughout the afternoon and into the evening. There was abundant food, music, dancing, and the sharing of stories both heartfelt and humorous. Grace and Preston moved through it all in a kind of joyful daze, accepting congratulations and participating in traditions, while exchanging private glances that spoke of their anticipation for when the festivities would end. As twilight deepened into night, lanterns illuminated the continuing celebration. Older guests began to depart, while the younger ones showed no signs of tiring. Finally, Preston took Grace's hand and quietly led her away from the gathering. "Where are we going?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Home," he said simply, leading her not toward the main house but along the path to the creek cabin. "Our private retreat just for tonight. Tomorrow we'll return to the main house as husband and wife, but tonight belongs to just us." The cabin awaited them, transformed by candlelight and fresh flowers. Someone Mrs. Callahan, Grace suspected, had prepared the space for their wedding night, adding special touches to make it romantic and welcoming. Standing in the doorway of their private sanctuary, Preston swept Grace into his arms in a gesture both playful and profound. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dawson," he whispered before carrying her across the threshold into their new life together. 5 years later, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Dawson Ranch as Grace stood on the porch of the main house, watching the approaching riders. Preston led the small group, his tall figure easily recognizable even at a distance. Beside him rode their 3-year-old son James, securely positioned in front of his father on the saddle, his little hands gripping the pommel with determined concentration. Behind them came Tobias, now the ranch foreman following his marriage to the blacksmith's daughter, and several other hands returning from the spring cattle drive to the high mountain pastures. Grace smiled as she observed her son's proud posture. James had his father's blue eyes and her brown hair, along with a spirited nature that kept them both constantly vigilant. Today marked his first official ranch duty, accompanying the men for the final short leg of the cattle drive, a rite of passage Preston had planned with great seriousness. At Grace's side, 1-year-old Emily struggled to be put down, eager to toddle toward her father and brother. "Wait, little one," Grace murmured, keeping a firm hold on the active child. "They'll be here soon enough." Life had changed dramatically in the 5 years since their wedding. The ranch had prospered under their joint management, with Preston handling the cattle operation while Grace oversaw the expanded educational program. What had begun as a simple one-room schoolhouse had grown into a proper school serving children from several neighboring properties, as well as Dawson Ranch. With Preston's encouragement, Grace had hired an assistant teacher last year, a young woman from Denver who brought new ideas and enthusiasm to their educational endeavors. This arrangement allowed Grace to balance her teaching responsibilities with motherhood and her role as the rancher's wife. The riders entered the ranch yard and James spotted Grace on the porch. "Mama, I helped drive the cattle. Papa said I did a real good job." Preston lifted the boy down from the saddle, and James ran toward the porch, his face alight with excitement. Grace set Emily down just as her brother reached them, and the little girl squealed with delight at her brother's return. "Did you indeed?" Grace asked, bending to embrace her son. "That sounds very important work." It was. "I had to sit real still and watch for strays, and Papa let me use his small binoculars." The boy's words tumbled out in enthusiasm. "And I saw an eagle, Mama, way up high over the North Ridge." Preston approached more slowly, handing his horse's reins to one of the hands. The years of marriage had softened some of his reserve, though he remained a man of quiet strength. His face, weathered by sun and wind, broke into a warm smile as he climbed the porch steps. "He was a fine trail hand," he confirmed, ruffling James's hair affectionately before leaning in to kiss Grace. "Didn't complain once, even when it got hot." "I'm very proud of you," Grace told her son. "Now go wash up for supper. Mrs. Callahan has been baking all afternoon in honor of your first cattle drive." The mention of the housekeeper's baking sent James racing into the house, all thoughts of cattle momentarily forgotten in favor of potential cookies. Emily toddled after her brother, determined not to be left behind. Preston pulled Grace into his arms for a proper greeting, his kiss conveying all the longing of their brief separation. "Missed you," he murmured against her hair. "3 days is too long." "We missed you too," Grace replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though your son has been telling everyone within earshot that he was helping Papa with important ranch business." Preston chuckled. "He's going to make a fine rancher someday. Has a natural eye for the animals already." They moved to the porch swing that Preston had built during Grace's first pregnancy, sitting close together as the evening began to settle over the ranch. This had become their ritual, a few quiet moments together at day's end to reconnect before the demands of family and community reclaimed their attention. "How was the new teacher while I was gone?" Preston asked, his arm around Grace's shoulders. "Miss Bennett is doing wonderfully. The children respond well to her, and she has excellent ideas for incorporating science experiments into the curriculum." Grace smiled at a memory. She was a bit flustered when the Freeman twins brought a snake into the classroom, but she recovered admirably. "Sounds like she's adapting to ranch life," Preston observed with amusement. "Any other news?" Grace hesitated briefly. Actually, yes. I received a letter from Judge Harmon's office in Aspen. Preston's expression darkened at the mention of the judge who had authorized Grace's auction 5 years earlier. What did he want? It seems he's retiring. The letter was an apology of sorts. Grace drew the folded paper from her pocket. He acknowledges that his ruling regarding my father's debts was legally questionable and morally wrong. He claims advancing age and pressure from certain business interests affected his judgment. Preston snorted skeptically. Convenient recognition now that he's leaving the bench. Perhaps, Grace acknowledged, but the letter also contained this. She handed Preston a document that had accompanied the judge's letter. Preston read it carefully, his eyebrows rising in surprise. This is a property deed for your father's mining claim. Apparently it wasn't entirely worthless after all, Grace explained. New surveying techniques revealed a viable copper vein that was missed initially. The judge says this represents my rightful inheritance, free and clear of all claims. This could be valuable, Preston said thoughtfully. What do you want to do with it? Grace had been considering this question since the letter arrived. I'd like to establish a proper trust for the school, make it permanent, independent of the ranch's fortunes. Ensure that children in this valley will always have access to education, regardless of what the future brings. Preston nodded, a smile spreading across his face. A fitting way to transform your father's legacy, from debt and bondage to education and opportunity. I thought so too, Grace agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. It feels like closing a circle somehow, taking what began as tragedy and completing its transformation into something beautiful. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ranch settle into evening routines. Lamps were being lit in the bunkhouse and workers' cabins. The distant sound of children's laughter carried from the direction of the creek where some of the older children were likely fishing before supper. You ever regret it? Preston asked suddenly. Coming west, all you went through. Grace considered the question seriously, as she had many times over the years. Not for a moment, she answered truthfully. What happened at that auction was terrible, but it led me here to this ranch, to our children, to you. How could I regret the path that brought me home? Preston's arm tightened around her shoulders. Sometimes I still can't believe how fortunate I was that day, that I happened to be in Aspen, that I saw you on that platform, that something made me step forward instead of riding away. Not fortune, Grace corrected gently. Providence. We were meant to find each other, through whatever strange path was necessary. From inside the house came the sound of Mrs. Callahan calling the children to help set the table, followed by James's excited voice asking if they could have cookies before supper, and the predictable negative response. Preston stood, offering Grace his hand. We should go in. Family awaits. As they walked toward the door of the home they had built together, Grace paused to look back at the ranch spread before them, the school building where children learned, the cabins where families lived, the barns and corrals where work continued day after day in the rhythm of seasons that had become the heartbeat of her life. I love you, Preston Dawson, she said simply. Thank you for winning me with your hands that day and with your heart every day since. Preston smiled, the expression transforming his features in the way that still made her heart skip. I love you too, Grace Dawson. Always will. Hand in hand, they entered their home, greeted by the chaos and joy of family life, a far cry from the despair Grace had felt standing on an auction block 5 years ago, but exactly where she was meant to be. The story that began with a desperate gamble at a county fair had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined, a love that had not only healed their individual wounds, but created a legacy of family, community, and hope that would endure long after them in the hearts and minds of all whose lives they touched.